Story number one. In the stillness of a psychiatric hospital's night shift, where every creak echoed like a whisper from the past, Ezra walked the wards, his flashlight a frail shield against the dark. The old building, steeped in decades of sorrow, seemed to breathe with the weight of its history. During a routine safety check, a silhouette loomed in a patient's room, tall, cloaked, and impossibly still, standing where no one should be. It wasn't a patient, wasn't a trick of the light, but something that stared back, waiting for Ezra to see it. When he stepped inside, it vanished, leaving only questions and a chill that clung to his bones. The hospital's walls, heavy with secrets, held the truth of that shadow, a presence that had no name but refused to be forgotten. The air grew thick, each step a trespass into a realm Ezra didn't understand. His flashlight swept empty corners, but the feeling of being watched never left. The patients slept, their breaths steady. Yet the ward felt alive with something older, something that knew his name. Each door he passed seemed to pulse with a silent warning, urging him to turn back. As Ezra recounted his tale, the hospital's darkness whispered back, daring him to seek the shadow that had chosen him to see. I was one of those quiet souls tending to those seeking help at a psychiatric hospital. Ezra, a mental health worker, found solace in the routine of his job, a rhythm that kept the chaos at bay, a place where the walls seemed to even sigh with every step you took. I was a mental health worker, and my days were stitched together with routine, none more sacred than the Q50 rounds. Every 15 minutes, we'd glide through the wards, eyes sharp, heart steady, checking that no one had slipped a noose around their despair or turned their fists on someone else or something. It was our job to keep the fragile peace, to make sure the patients and us, the staff, made it through the night unbroken. Most nights I worked my core unit. The ward was his anchor, its quirks as familiar as family. That's what we called it anyway. The ward that felt like home, where you knew the creak of every bed frame, the way the light slanted through the blinds, and the soft snores of the familiar faces that you'd came to care for, even if you'd never say it out loud. But tonight, he was reassigned. But that night, they sent me floating. Floating? It's when they pull you from your safe little nest and drop you into another unit, a stranger's territory, where the air tastes different and the shadows don't quite line up right. I didn't mind. Well, usually here, change of pace could be a bit of a mercy sometimes, but this night wasn't as merciful as I'd hoped. The new ward felt alien, its silence heavier, its corners sharper. The hospital, an aging labyrinth, carried the weight of countless lives, some mended, some broken beyond repair. Ezra's flashlight was his guide, its beam a thin thread of certainty in the dark. I was on rounds, my flashlight, a dim wand in my hand, moving from door to door. Each door to the units had a small window, a peephole into the dark where 3 patients slept, or tried to in every room. He moved carefully, respecting the fragile rest of those within. Normally, I'd nudge the door open, slow and soft, so the hinges wouldn't scream and wake them. You don't disturb the sleeping here. It's really unkind. And some of them carried ghosts in their heads. PTSD, the kind that turns a sudden light into a bomb blast. Ezra paused at one door, his instincts prickling, and chose the flashlight over the knob. But this time, I stopped short, I flicked my flashlight through the window instead, aiming it at the far wall away from their faces. I didn't want to be the one to rip them from whatever piece they'd clawed out of the night. The beam caught something, a silhouette, tall and wrong, standing between the beds. The beam hit the wall, though, and there it was, a silhouette, stark and wrong, standing between the beds. Ezra's stomach lurched, his breath catching. My stomach twisted. 3 beds, 3 bodies, all accounted for. But this was a fourth, a shape that shouldn't be here. It stood motionless, a dark figure in a long coat, its presence heavy with intent. It loomed there, tall and still, like it had been waiting for me to look. In that brief moment, time felt as though it stood still. He considered possibilities. A patient wandering from another room, perhaps through a shared bathroom. I thought quickly. Maybe a patient from the next room slipped through the bathroom that joined them or something. A common enough trespass in a place like this. The rooms were paired, stitched together by the small restrooms where people shuffled in the dark. I mean, I'd seen it before. Sleepwalkers, wanderers, lost souls, chasing shadows of their own. Ezra eased the door open, his pulse racing. I eased the door open, quiet as a prayer, and stepped inside. The room was cold, the air thick with a sour, ancient scent. The air was cold, heavy with the sour tang of sleep and something older, something that clung to the back of your throat. The patient slept, undisturbed. 3 patients lay there, chest rising and falling, soft, steady, lost in their dreams or their drugs. But the 4th was gone, leaving only emptiness, but the 4th gone, vanished like smoke. Ezra swept his light, finding nothing but the familiar. I swung my light around and nothing, just the beds, the blankets, the faint hum of the hospital's pulse. He checked the bathroom. The bathroom door was right there. So I crept over, heart hammering, and pushed it open. It was empty, a dead end. Empty, and no patient, no hiding spot. And then it hit me. This room didn't connect. No access to another patient room on the other side, just a lone dead-end box of plaster and silence, which means that whatever I had seen had been here, standing like a sentinel. And now, suddenly, it wasn't. His hands trembled as he recounted the patient's breaths. I did a double take and checked the patients again, counting breaths like a lifeline. Rise, and fall. All 3 safe, all 3 real. He backed out. The doors click, a gunshot in the quiet. My hands shook as I backed out, shutting the door with a click that felt too loud. Ezra scoured the ward, his flashlight a frantic search for logic. I tore through the unit, counting every head against the roster, desperate for an answer. Every patient was accounted for, no one out of place. Every patient was where they should be, though tucked in or pacing their own little worlds. No extras, no escapees, just the number that we'd started with. But the shadow had been real, its form etched in his mind, a figure in a long coat, sharp and deliberate. But I had seen it, a shadow, whole and solid, draped in what looked like a long coat, its edges sharp as a blade against the dimness. At the nurse's station, he confessed to a veteran co-worker, her eyes seemed but weary. Back at the nurse's station, I spilled it all to the others. A woman with kind eyes and a voice like warm gravel, someone who'd been here long enough to wear the place like a second skin. She nodded, unsurprised. She didn't flinch. "Yeah, I've seen things too," she said, soft as a secret. She told me about the half-ghost that she caught once, a torso and head floating above a bed like a balloon cut loose. No legs, no sense to it. Ezra's experience was different, grounded, not a fragment, but a presence. I told her that mine was different, full-bodied, grounded, a figure in a coat that didn't drift but stood watching and waiting. What was it? I could never pin it down. And really, that's what gnawed at me. The hospital's history offered clues, decades of anguish, patients lost to despair, their pain soaked into the walls. My mind spun, chasing itself in circles, a ghost, maybe some poor soul who had never left, trapped in these walls that reek of bleach and misery. I mean, this place was ancient, soaked in decades of pain, patients strapped down, minds shattered, lives snuffed out even, or perhaps a memory replaying endlessly, or was it something else, a residual, a memory burned into the air, replaying like a film strip stuck on a single frame. But I'd seen it clear as the goosebumps on my arms. Ezra wanted to dismiss it as fatigue, a trick of the night. I wanted to believe that it was just my eyes playing tricks, that late hour of twisting shadows into monsters. But deep down, I knew better. It had been there, real as the heartbeat in my chest, and it left me with a chill that I couldn't shake and a strange, quiet ache from whatever it was that lingered unseen in the dark. The shadow haunted Ezra's nights, a silent question he couldn't answer. He avoided floating shifts, clinging to his core unit's familiarity, but the hospital's darkness never felt the same. Each creak, each flicker carried the echo of that figure, a sentinel watching from a place beyond reach. Story number 2. The building was a fortress of steel and glass, its corridors humming with the quiet of the graveyard shift. But for Clara, a 23-year-old night worker, it was just another workplace. Until the darkness began to stir, she'd spent nearly 2 years in these halls, feeling safe, unbothered by the late hours or empty rooms. But something changed. A shift in the air that turned the familiar into a maze of shadows. Doors slammed without cause, whispers echoed from nowhere, and Clara knew she wasn't alone. The grave shift was a world of its own. The building silent save for the hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of officers. Clara's routine was simple: monitor screens, file reports, keep the place running until dawn. But the night held secrets, and the building's calm was a lie, hiding something that watched her every move. When I first started, everything felt genuinely safe, and I never felt anything weird, as in ghostly, or anything of the sort. Yet, as months passed, the safety eroded, replaced by a creeping dread that grew with each shift. It started small, a sound that shouldn't have been. Clara and a co-worker, alone in the building, froze as a heavy metal door slammed shut, its echo ringing through the halls. They exchanged glances, hearts racing, knowing no draft could move that door. The first time me and a co-worker got spooked, it was just me and her in the building, and we clearly heard a door slam. And this isn't any normal door. 2, it's a huge, heavy metal door. They checked the window expecting an officer, but no one emerged. And since our cameras weren't working, we ran to the window that we have to see if anyone ever came out of the hallway, but no one ever did. The silence that followed was worse, a weight that kept them huddled together until dawn. We shrugged it off. But that night, we both stayed together in the same room until the officers came back into the building closer to the shift change. Months later, the evidence room became a turning point. Clara, curious and new, ventured in to retrieve items, the dim lights casting long shadows. She lingered, drawn to a glass display of crime scene photos, her phone's flashlight revealing grim details. Some months later, I needed to go and retrieve some items from the evidence room, and I think that's when things really started to amp up a bit. So, I walked in, and the room had two dim lights in it. The room felt alive, its air thick with unease. Being the curious person that I am, I started to look around. Being relatively new, I never really went into the evidence for anything, and curiosity got the better of me, I guess. But they had this large glass display on the wall that showed crime scene photos taken. She left, but returning later, fear gripped her, a primal anxiety she couldn't shake. But when I went back to return the items, I felt what you would describe as fear, or just genuinely feeling anxious about being back in there for some reason. The incidents multiplied. Whispers from empty offices, fleeting glimpses of a figure in the hallway, gone when she looked again. The building was no longer just a workplace. It was a puzzle, each night revealing another piece of something unseen. But in the next months, I would sometimes hear people talking in the offices that I knew for a fact that were unoccupied, or I would sort of catch a glimpse of a dark figure or what I thought was a co-worker in the middle of the hallway and immediately look, and there was never anyone there. One night, the tension broke. Co-workers saw a figure with long hair slip into a room, but no one checked. Fear holding them back. A shift had just begun, and I'd sat down to settle in, and a coworker goes, "Who the heck is that?" And another stated, "Close the door." I was like, "What?" And they told me that we just saw someone with long hair go in there. Clara's unease grew, the building's silence now a threat, alone. She dimmed the lights, her head throbbing, when the main entrance door sounded, and well, at about 3 a.m., I decided to switch the lights off as my head was starting to hurt a little bit, and I sat back down, and that's when I heard what I know to be the main door entrance. The camera screens showed nothing, no one in the lobby, no movement in the restroom. My eyes darted to the screen that shows all of our cameras, and I didn't see anyone in the lobby or go into our restroom. But I thought surely if they did go into the restroom, I would hear the toilet flush, or at least I'll see them. She waited, but silence reigned. I waited, and no one ever came out. Then another slammed the metal door behind her, impossible without force. I then thought that maybe I was just spooking myself out, but then I heard a door slam in the area behind mine. Clara tried to focus, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Again, it's a very large metal door that needs to be slammed to be closed, and they don't just open or close with the draft from the AC or anything. She stood, flipping on the lights, and found 2 kitchen cabinets wide open. Though she'd seen them closed, I finally got the courage to stand up and turn the lights on. And I found 2 cabinets in our kitchen that I know were closed, wide open. She sat, frozen, her mind racing. Now, I immediately sat down because I just didn't know what to do. Then it came, a tug on her hair, light but real, and the slow crunch of the chair behind her turning. I began monitoring again, and that was when I felt it, like the hair behind my ear was being pulled lightly. I could feel and sense someone was sitting on the chair behind me, staring at me, too. And I could hear a very specific crunch sound the wall made when somebody sat in that chair and twisted it. Terrified, Clara checked the cabinets again. They were closed, as if mocking her. Eventually, I knew my shift was almost over, and I got enough courage to go into the kitchen and close the cabinets. And when I walked over, I swear to you that the cabinets, they were now closed. She called an officer to stand with her until the shift ended. I had 20 minutes left on my shift. And in those 20 minutes, I had an officer stand with me in the doorway the whole time because I was absolutely terrified. Clara took a week off and the incident stopped. But the building never felt the same. Now, I took the next week off and I didn't see or hear anything after that. She still warned her co-workers it was haunted. The feeling of eyes on her lingering. Either way, I still tell my co-workers that this place is haunted. And occasionally, I'll still get the feeling of being watched in different areas of the building. Story number 3. The backyard was cloaked in darkness, a quiet Ohio night broken only by the rustle of dogs. A man stood in the shadows, unaware of the eyes that watched from beyond the fence. Then a glow appeared, not of this world, but alive. Standing tall in the neighbor's yard, it turned, its gaze piercing the night. And fear, it became a living thing. For Nate, this wasn't just a late night, it was a moment that shattered his sense of reality. Nate, in Akron, Ohio, came home late from testing gas stations. He let his dogs out to relieve themselves, feeling an urge to peek around his house toward the neighbor's yard. He barely looked around the corner, seeing something that chilled him deeply. It was a dark night, perhaps a crescent or new moon, pitch black outside. He'd stepped out to grab gear from his work truck, set it inside the side door, and returned to check on the dogs. After they finished, he let them inside, but felt compelled to look around the house corner, unsure why. He peeked and saw a creature in the neighbor's fenced backyard, standing at the yard's edge, facing the woods. Nate saw its side profile, 6 to 7 feet tall, pale white skin glowing like under a light. Despite this darkness, it was human-like, naked, muscular, yet smooth, with no genitalia, staring into the woods. The sight froze Nate, his breath shallow, as if the night itself held him in place. He watched, hidden in disbelief, until the creature snapped its head toward him, staring directly. Nate panicked, ran in, slammed and locked the door, fearing it would come for him. His heart pounded, expecting a knock that never came. The creature was 6 to 7 feet, bright pale skin, smooth and muscular, naked with no genitalia, standing motionless except for turning its head. Nate never saw it again, nor anything like it before or since. It reminded him of the Prometheus creature, but wasn't identical. The memory burned, vivid and unrelenting, like a nightmare that refused to fade. Nate told his brother, a mechanic who'd lived in Akron for years. "That yard's always been strange," he said. "Folks see things near those woods." He mentioned old stories of lights in the trees, figures that vanished when approached. Nate's skin prickled, recalling the creature's glow, its gaze that seemed to see through him. He checked online forums, finding tales of pale, hairless beings in Ohio's rural fringes, some calling them moon watchers for their nocturnal stares. None matched exactly, but the similarities unnerved him. Nate's dogs, usually calm, growled at the backyard fence for weeks after. He wondered if they sensed it, still lurking just out of sight. Nate avoided the backyard at night, keeping lights on and curtains drawn. Some nights, he felt a pull to look outside, like that night, but resisted, fearing what waited. He spoke to a neighbor, an elderly woman who'd lived there decades. "Those woods hold things," she whispered. "Not human, not animal." She told of a farmer in the 1950s who saw a glowing figure by his barn, vanishing into the trees. "It didn't want to be seen," she said, her eyes darting to the fence. Nate found a library record of unexplained sightings in Akron, dating back centuries, often near the woods behind his street. One entry described a pale sentinel that watched from the shadows, never approaching but always knowing. Nate moved a year later, unable to shake the feeling that the creature knew his name. Even now, in a new house, he checks the yard at night, half expecting that pale glow to return. Story number 4. The house was a sanctuary, but something lingered in its corners. A teenage boy sat in his room, the glow of his Xbox casting shadows as he explored a virtual world. A sudden cry pierced the quiet, sharp and wrong, echoing from another room. He froze, the game forgotten. As the air grew heavy with an unseen weight, something had moved in the house, something that shouldn't have. The walls, familiar and warm, now seemed to watch, their silence hiding a presence that refused to show itself. The cold room in the attic was a refuge, but it held its own secrets. Suitcases, neatly stacked, toppled without warning, defying gravity to fall away from him. The chill wasn't just the air. It was a presence, brushing against his skin, deliberate and unseen. He stood, heart racing, searching for a cause that wasn't there. What force could bend the rules of the world, and why was it here? The house, once a home, was now a stage for something beyond understanding. And at night, the darkness whispered his name, a voice that wasn't human. The sound grew closer, insistent, pulling him from sleep to search the empty halls. No one was there, but the echoes lingered, a call from nowhere that knew him. He checked every room, every corner, finding only silence. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. Was it the house itself, or something older, tied to its bones? The boy's solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. A shadow moved outside, a fleeting glimpse of a man by the window. It vanished before he could be sure, leaving only the certainty of eyes in the dark. The house wasn't empty. It was alive, its secrets stirring in the night. He stood frozen, the memory of that figure burning into his mind, a warning of something that didn't belong. Could he trust his senses, or was the house playing tricks? The unseen presence was no longer subtle. It was claiming the space around him. The boy's world had shifted, each event a thread in a tapestry of fear. The doll, the suitcases, the voice, the shadow, they weren't accidents, but signs of something watching, waiting. He couldn't stay, but leaving wouldn't erase the mark it left. The house held its secrets close, and he was part of them now, caught in a dance with the unseen. Some places don't let you go, and this house was one of them. Ethan, a shy teenager, loved his quiet evenings at home, playing Minecraft on his Xbox 360, trying to grasp console controls after years on mobile. One night, a cry from his parents' room startled him. He asked his little brother what happened, who said a Mexican doll, kept in its case for years, had moved slightly, its tilt obvious from the side. It was a subtle shift, but unnerving, a change no one could explain. Ethan tried to dismiss it, but the house felt altered, its warmth laced with a quiet unease, as if something had awakened within its walls. When family visited, Ethan gave up his room and moved to a small attic room with a ladder, a space that was always cold, no matter the season. One night, suitcases stacked neatly in the room fell over, but to the side, not on him, despite logic suggesting they should have. The event shook him, the room's chill intensifying, as if the air itself had intent, diverting the cases with purpose. He searched for reasons, drafts, uneven floors, but found none. The house's silence deepening his confusion. As an introvert who didn't go out much, Ethan cherished home's quiet, even in a new city. One night, he heard his name called, the sound growing closer until it was unmistakable. He scoured the house, finding no one, and called his parents, crying. The voice wasn't theirs, and noises in the house terrified him, faint steps and creaks with no source. He checked every shadow, heart racing, but the house was empty. Yet the call persisted, a whisper from something unseen that knew him. Another night, late, he saw what he thought was a man by the window, gone in a moment. He was certain he saw someone and searched again, finding no one. The glimpse was brief but vivid, a figure vanishing into the dark. Ethan's fear grew, the house no longer a haven, but a web of shadows. Each event, the doll, the suitcases, the voice, the figure, built a sense of something alive within the walls, its purpose unclear but undeniable. Years later, Ethan, now free of that house, carried the memories like a weight. He'd never told anyone, but the events haunted him, each one a piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. The house wasn't just a building, it was a vessel holding something ancient, something that knew him. The doll's shift, the suitcases fall, the voice in the night, the shadow at the window, they were messages, signs of a presence that didn't need to speak to be felt. Ethan had left, but the unseen presence followed, a shadow in his mind, a reminder that some homes keep their secrets forever. Story number 5. The house stood alone in the Colombian hills, its walls kissed by mist from the ever-humming Rio Espe. Elena and her partner, Diego, had moved in, seeking a fresh start, their hearts full of hope for their unborn child. We had just moved into a house, a secluded finca tucked into the hills near Rio Espe, where the trees drip mist and the river never sleeps. The air was thick, heavy with the river's song, a sound that never ceased, even in the deepest night. It was the kind of place that you imagine is peaceful, fertile, a place to start again, I guess. But peace was a lie. The house felt alive, watching, waiting. My partner was 4 months pregnant, and we were really excited, but also very cautious, still adjusting to the rhythms of the land, the quiet. The night was a shroud, wrapping the house in silence. It all started, though, in the very first week, late at night while we slept upstairs. Her mother, brother, and sister, who were staying with us at the time, began to hear something. It came soft at first, a faint cry carried on the wind, cutting through the fog. A voice, a woman's voice, faint but urgent, floating in from just beyond the house. What they heard was, "Help me." It wasn't a scream, but a plea, raw and human, tugging at their hearts. It didn't come every night, but it came enough. Elena's family stirred, their whispers tense in the dark, wondering if someone was lost, hurt, just outside. The voice returned, relentless, closer each time, and first once, then again. And by the second week, they had heard it 3 times. It lingered near the windows, a soft wail that seemed to seep through the walls. They said that it wasn't a scream, it wasn't loud, it was worse than that. Really, it was soft, pained, and human. Elena's mother checked the yard, flashlight in hand, but found only stillness. The trees unmoving, the river's hum unbroken. At first, they thought that it was my partner calling for help from upstairs. After assuring them that it wasn't her, they would look outside, thinking that maybe someone was lost, maybe even hurt, but there was just never anyone there. The night swallowed their questions, leaving only the echo of that voice. Then the house turned cruel. That night, my partner began to have sudden, severe pain, cramping that felt like contractions. Elena clutched Diego's hand, her face pale, fear twisting her gut. We were terrified. It was far too early for labor, and we really didn't know what to do. The pain came in waves, sharp and wrong, as if the house itself was pressing against her. We were upstairs focused completely on her, and for reasons that I still cannot explain. We didn't have our phones with us, and they were downstairs forgotten in the rush of the fear. Panic blinded them, the night stretching endless, the river's song louder, mocking. I guess honestly too. We thought that we had written it out for the most part because by morning the pain had eased and we were exhausted but relieved. Oh my, all that it. Morning brought a new terror until we spoke to the security guard at the front gate of our residential. He asked us what had happened the night before, and we said nothing. Why? And he told us that an ambulance came to your house at around 1 a.m. His words hit like a stone. Someone had called, a woman's voice pleading for help from their property. Apparently, someone called from here, from your property, and said that there was a woman in distress. But we hadn't called. No one in the house had. The guard's eyes were wary, his voice low as he described the ambulance's lights, its unanswered knocks. And yet the ambulance arrived, lights flashing, knocking at the gate. And because we didn't answer his call, the security guard refused to let them enter. The night had betrayed them, and something else had spoken. The truth came slowly, pieced together from whispers of neighbors and elders. It wasn't until we started asking around recently, neighbors, guards, even the older people in the nearby town, that we began to understand and put all the pieces together. They spoke of La Llorona, the weeping woman, a name that carried weight in these hills. We were told very plainly, in fact, that that's La Llorona. But this was no mere ghost story. She was different here, more cunning. You live near the river now. Pregnant women, crying children, and pain draw her in like blood in the water. Elena's pregnancy, her pain, had called to something ancient, something that lingered by the river's edge. But what's the most terrifying to us is that here, in this part where we live, especially in this town, the stories go deeper. La Llorona didn't just haunt rivers. She used the modern world, slipping through cracks of technology. The stories grew darker, more unsettling. She doesn't just cry by rivers anymore. Apparently, she doesn't just appear in white veils either. Elders spoke of phones ringing with no one on the line, only soft seas. They say that she has learned how to use the modern world. Allegedly, there are stories of phones ringing and no one on the other end, but weeping. Baby monitors catching whispers. Diego found tales of baby monitors hissing with a woman's voice, words too faint to catch, emergency services receiving calls from homes where no one made them, and ambulances, like theirs, arriving unbidden, summoned by a voice no human spoke. And just like us, ambulances showing up to rural houses in the night, responding to a cry for help that no human ever gave. La Llorona was no ghost. She was a force, a pattern woven into sorrow. They learned the rules too late. Some people believe that she's not just a spirit anymore. She's a pattern, a force that clings to sorrow and technology alike, a kind of ghost intelligence using whatever tools she can to get past the walls of a home to be let in. She sought entry, drawn to pain, to vulnerability, and they say that if you respond to her voice, if you open the door even out of kindness or confusion, that you give her permission to enter. Elena and Diego had stayed silent, their door locked, but the fear lingered. We didn't hear her that night. We didn't open the door, thank goodness. Yet the house felt marked, its walls no longer a shield. But I truly believe that she tried. Their daughter was born, a fragile light in the dark. Our baby is still safe, well, at least for now. But the river never slept, its hum a constant reminder of her presence. Our daughter is 6 weeks old now, and she is still trying to get in. Elena heard it sometimes, a faint cry, not from the baby monitor, but from the air itself, pleading. But at least now we know what we're up against, and we cannot wait to move away from this river. They planned their escape, but the house fought back. At night, the lights flickered, the phone buzzed with static, a voice just beyond hearing. They avoided the windows, kept the doors bolted, but the air grew heavy, oppressive. Elena sought help, speaking to a local curandera named Marta. Marta's eyes darkened as she listened, her hands tracing old symbols in the air. La Llorona is no ghost. She's a wound, open and hungry, she said. She finds you through pain, through fear, and you gave her both. Marta offered a ritual, copal, salt, a circle to bind her, but it meant facing the river, speaking to the voice. Elena hesitated, the memory of that night too raw. But the signs grew bolder. The baby monitor hummed at night, a soft "help me," cutting through the static. They tried the ritual, burning copal in their home, but the air grew colder, the river louder. One night, Elena woke to a shadow by the crib, not moving, just watching. She didn't scream, didn't open the door, but La Llorona was there, and she wasn't leaving. Story number 6. The woods near Lake Lanier were a place of secrets, where the air carried whispers of the haunted waters just 4 miles away. For Jesse, who lived along the Chattahoochee, the forest was both a refuge and a warning, its shadows heavy with an unseen presence. He'd ventured there often, seeking solitude with a joint in hand, but each trip left him with a creeping dread, an oppressive feeling that something watched, something that didn't welcome him. The trees seemed to hold their breath, the birds silent, the world unnaturally still. Jesse knew the stories. Lake Lanier, the most haunted lake in America, steeped in tales of tragedy and restless spirits. He'd laughed them off, chalking up the unease to the haze of weed or an overactive imagination. But the forest had a way of proving him wrong. Its silence not peaceful, but menacing. A quiet that smothered sound and movement. He'd felt it in daylight. A weight that followed him until he reached his car. The safety of metal and glass, a thin shield against whatever lingered. His brother, Ethan, and Ethan's friend, Caleb, had their own story, one that made Jesse's skin crawl. They'd been down by the river on a muddy ledge off the secluded trail, the kind of spot where the world felt far away. The forest had been alive with its usual hum, crickets, rustling leaves, until it wasn't. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circled them, too close for comfort. They whispered guesses, hoping it was just a deer. But the air turned thick, the same oppressive weight Jesse knew too well. They turned, and there it was, a shadow, towering 9 feet tall, perched at the top of the dip, its glowing white eyes cutting through the darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, its presence a silent threat that froze them in place. Ethan and Caleb didn't wait, didn't think. They scrambled up the bank, their feet slipping in the mud, and ran, hearts pounding, until they reached their truck. The forest had let them go, but those eyes stayed with them, a memory that refused to fade. Jesse had been to that spot himself, drawn to the river's edge despite the warnings in his gut. He'd felt the same silence, heard the same footsteps, and then something worse, a sound like no animal he knew, a grinding, organic roar mixed with a high-pitched screech, like a chainsaw birthed from flesh and feathers. It chased him, echoing through the trees, urging him to run faster, to abandon his bag and sprint for his car. The forest wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted him gone. So, we live right on the Chattahoochee and around 4 miles from Lake Lanier, the most haunted lake in the USA. Jesse's home was close enough to feel the lake's shadow, its reputation seeping into the woods. Apparently, the woods around that area, I can confirm, are 100% haunted. Sometimes you get this sort of oppressive. You're being watched, and it's not friendly feeling. He'd felt it too many times, a presence that clung to him. I used to smoke weed out there from time to time, and the oppressive, evil feeling would sometimes follow me until I left those woods and got into my car. It's the kind of evil that quiets the birds, silences the bugs, and makes the tree stop swaying a bit. The forest stillness was a warning, a sign something was wrong. There's even a patch of wood in my own neighborhood that I don't go into anymore because of the evil feeling that I described. Jesse avoided that stretch. It's pulled too strong, too dark. My brother and his friend, on the other hand, they allegedly did see something. So, they were smoking weed in the woods on the banks of this little secluded ledge of mud by some trees off of a walking trail where the dirt dips down towards the river. Ethan and Caleb had thought it safe, a hidden spot for a quiet night. They speculated on what it was, and one of them said out loud, "That's got to be a deer for sure." Their words seemed to provoke it, because my brother and his friend, they suddenly felt the same oppressive feeling that I felt many times before and turned around, and there was this shadow, is what they said, around 9 feet tall, standing at the top of the dip with glowing white eyes leering down at them. The two of them didn't say a word, didn't even look at each other. In fact, they just scrambled up the right side of the dip, and they started running as fast as they could back to their vehicle. Jesse understood their fear, having felt it himself. Now, I've been to that dip in the dirt by the river a lot. In fact, I went there recently, and I heard something strange during that day that caused me to start running for my car as fast as I could, too. The sound had come without warning, unnatural and relentless. And look, I know that this is going to sound weird, but honestly, this is what it sounded like. It was like an organic chainsaw mixed with a high-pitched bird. I had forgotten my bag, which had the keys to the car as well. I snagged it as fast as I could, and I just started running. But then the sound followed me like it was pursuing me. Jesse's heart had raced. The sound chasing him through the trees? I'm out there a lot, and I know most of the bird sounds out there, and genuinely, that did not sound like anything that I have ever heard. It wasn't natural, wasn't animal. It was something else, something tied to the lake's dark lore. Ethan had seen it again, driving down the road with Caleb, their truck's floodlights catching a glimpse of a 9-foot humanoid shape peering from behind a tree, its eyes glowing white. Watching as they passed, my brother and the same friend were driving at night with the floodlights on, and they saw something about 9 foot tall and humanoid peek out from behind a tree at one stage and just sort of watch them as they drove by. The road, like the woods, felt unsafe, tainted by whatever haunted the area. Jesse joined Ethan and his friends at a makeshift fort Ethan had built against a fence in the woods, a place they thought was a sanctuary. My brother has a fort built in those woods too, and last week I went to the fort at night with him and his friends, and he went on a speech about how nothing crosses the fence the fort was built up against. Ethan's bravado had been reckless, a challenge to the unseen, and almost like he was challenging whatever it was to cross the fence and do so. Jesse and the others begged him to stop, their nerves frayed. We all begged him to stop because that mentality wasn't good for the trip that we're about to take. The group left the fort, the woods pressing in, the silence heavier than ever. Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's words had stirred something, that the thing with the glowing eyes was listening, waiting. The lake's reputation, the stories of restless spirits, felt all too real now. Jesse avoided the woods after that, the dip by the river, a place he'd never returned to. The sound, the eyes, the shadow. They were part of the forest now, part of him. A fear that lingered long after he locked his car door and drove away. Story number 7. The graveyard was a silent sea of stones, its air heavy with the weight of forgotten names. Clara and her boyfriend, Ethan, walked their dogs through the night. The only sound, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. The darkness was a cloak, pierced by the faint glow of street lamps. But tonight felt different, as if the graves were listening. Clara paused to read the headstones, whispering blessings to the dead, unaware that her words might stir something restless. Then, from the shadows, a hum, low, deliberate, broke the silence, and Clara's heart froze as she sensed eyes watching from the dark. The man appeared without warning, his suit crisp and out of place in the small town stillness. His humming was a melody of unease, curling through the air like a warning. Clara's dog, usually reactive only to other animals, stiffened, whining, her body taut as she pulled toward the stranger. The night seemed to tighten, the lamps casting long shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Clara's skin prickled. She knew this man wasn't just a passerby, but something more, something tied to the graves she'd spoken to. The park beyond the graveyard was gated, its iron bars a frail barrier against the night. As they entered, a woman in loose, shapeless clothes emerged from the distance, her gaze fixed on them, unblinking, her features lost in shadow. Clara's breath caught. The woman's stare was a weight, pressing against her soul as if she knew secrets Clara hadn't shared. The dogs growled, sensing what Clara felt. These figures weren't human, weren't meant to be here. And the graveyard's peace had been disturbed by her words. The field stretched before them, empty but alive with an unseen presence. Clara tried to focus on Ethan, on the normalcy of their walk, but the woman's silhouette lingered in her mind, her stare a hook in Clara's thoughts. They moved toward the park's entrance, but the air grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the night itself was conspiring to keep them there. Clara's words to the graves echoed in her head. Had she called something forth, something that now followed, waiting for her to falter? Then there she was again, pressed against the bars, her gaze unrelenting. Clara's whisper to Ethan was a plea, and his shout broke the spell, sending the woman scuttling into the dark. The night swallowed her, but the fear remained, a certainty that Clara and Ethan had crossed paths with something not of this world. They fled. The graveyard and park no longer sanctuaries, but traps, haunted by watchers who knew their names. Clara and Ethan walked their dogs late, a habit born of necessity. Me and my boyfriend, we tend to walk our dogs late at night due to them being a bit reactive. Their route wound through a graveyard to a park. Our route goes to a graveyard, and we walk round and then to a park. Clara often spoke to the graves, but tonight she read their names, offering a quiet blessing. And during walking in the graveyard, I tend to talk to the graves, but today I decided to read their names and simply say, "I hope you're resting well." On a deserted road, lit only by sparse lamps, a man in a suit appeared, humming eerily. We were walking down a long, dead road, only lit by street lamps, that we had a very creepy encounter with a man in a suit humming. Clara's dog reacted, not as she would to dogs, but with fear. One of our dogs is reactive, like I said, but only to other dogs due to trauma of being attacked. But this time around, she also reacted to this man, started whining and getting stiff, pulling and trying to bark at him, which she normally only ever does to other dogs. They moved on, but a woman in baggy clothes approached, staring. While walking past this humming suit man, I see what seems to be a woman in baggy clothes walk in the distance toward us. In the gated park, she passed close, her gaze piercing. We get into the park. which is fully gated with around a 6-foot barred fence, which is where we typically let the dogs off to have a bit of a runaround. This woman is walking directly past us, very close to this barred fence, just staring at us. Clara hesitated, unnerved. I never saw her features, but could clearly and very obviously tell that she was looking at us. This made me hesitate to let the dogs off a bit. As they walked up the field, Clara saw her again, pressed against the bars, motionless. I looked at him and noticed the same woman in the corner of my eye, standing in the pavement outside of the park, basically nose against the bars, staring at us and not moving. Clara whispered to Ethan. I said quietly, "She's staring at us." You know, Ethan's shout startled her, and she fled strangely. My boyfriend then turned his head and saw her, then said quite loudly, for that time of the night, "What the heck?" And as soon as he said this, she turned around in a fast and strange manner and just sort of scuttled away. Clara's spiritual instinct screamed these figures weren't human, perhaps summoned by her words to the dead. I'm a bit of a spiritual person, and I feel in my heart that these people were up to no good or possibly weren't even human. They hurried home, the night heavy with their fear. We didn't see her again, but both of us were pretty freaked out by these colliding encounters and very soon headed home. The graveyard stones now felt alive, their names a warning Clara would never ignore again. Story number 8. The Victorian house stood like a sentinel, its wraparound balcony cloaked in shadows that seemed to breathe. Clara stepped onto the creaking porch, her best friend Mia at her side, the air thick with the scent of old wood and blooming oleanders. Mia's mother, a restless renter, had settled into this 2-story gem built in the 1860s, its charm masking a darker history. Clara felt a prickle on her neck as they crossed the threshold, the house's grandeur both inviting and oppressive. The burgundy-carpeted stairs groaned underfoot, as if reluctant to share their secrets. Something lingered here, something that watched from the walls, and Clara was about to spend the night in its domain. The interior was a maze of history, ornate moldings, stained glass windows, and hidden passages. Mia's mother, Ellen, led Clara on a tour, her voice bubbling with excitement over the house's quirks. She showed the cool historical features, including closets with secret doors hidden in the back that opened into hallways and walls leading to other rooms. Clara marveled at the craftsmanship, but unease grew with each step, the house feeling alive, its corridors too quiet. Ellen's tales of strange events deepened the chill. She mentioned an office with one entrance found locked from the inside with no explanation, and mornings when jewelry or medication was placed in a perfect pile on her bedroom floor. The stories hinted at a presence, one tied to the house's grim past. Ellen's voice dropped as she spoke of the former owner, a bitter widow who'd poisoned her housekeepers with oleander from the backyard. She explained that this bitter old lady would poison her housekeepers with the white oleanders that filled the backyard. The flower beds, vibrant and lush, now seemed sinister, their beauty a mask for cruelty. Clara's excitement turned to dread. She'd be sleeping here tonight, alone in the living room. The house's charm faded, its walls seeming to lean closer, whispering of those who'd never left. They pushed on with the evening, sharing dinner and movies, but Clara's mind lingered on the oleanders, the locked office, the unseen hands arranging trinkets in the night. Night fell, and Clara settled on the living room couch, the vast space swallowing the TV's faint glow. She chose to leave the TV on to give visibility to the dark, open space, feeling an overwhelming silence, and as though she was being watched. The air was heavy, the silence not empty, but alive, pressing against her skin. She faced the back of the couch, hoping to block out the room's shadows, but sleep was a distant hope. Every creak, every flicker of the TV felt like a signal. Something was there, just out of sight. She fell asleep facing the couch, but it wasn't sleep. It felt like an out-of-body experience, standing beside the couch, watching herself sleep the entire night. Her consciousness hovered, eyes fixed on her own still form, the TV's flashing lights painting the scene with eerie precision. The vision was too real. The programs on the couch's worn fabric, the exact angle of her hand, the details were insanely accurate, down to the flashing lights from the TV screen. Clara's spirit, or whatever it was, refused to look away, as if guarding her body from an unseen threat. The house hummed with presence, its hidden passages and locked doors a labyrinth for something restless. Morning brought no relief. Clara woke exhausted, as if she'd never slept, her body heavy with the weight of the night. She swore she would never sleep in that house again. The experience wasn't a dream, but a vigil, her soul standing sentinel against whatever haunted the Victorian. Ellen moved out soon after, driven by more unsettling events and a medium's dire warnings. The medium spoke of a spirit tethered to the house, its malice rooted in the oleander poisonings. Clara researched the property, finding records of the widow, her cruelty a stain on the house's history. The secret passages, once a charming quirk, now seemed like veins for the spirit to travel. Watching its new tenants, Clara never returned, but the memory of that night clung to her, the sensation of standing outside herself a mark she couldn't erase. The Victorian still stands, its balcony empty, waiting for the next guest to feel its watchful gaze. Story number 9. The triplex was a rundown place, its walls thin, its stairs creaking under every step. Nick lived there with Mike, his best friend, in a cramped apartment that smelled of old paint and regret. The upstairs neighbors were loud, their footsteps echoing through the ceiling. But Nick never thought much of them until the night everything changed. A message pinged on his Xbox, its words freezing his blood. Mike alone had been held at gunpoint. The danger wasn't a stranger, it was the kids from upstairs. Nick stared at the screen, the glow of his game fading as panic set in. He was miles away, in a new trailer with new roommates, but Mike's words pulled him back. They broke in, took everything. The message was raw, trembling with fear. Nick's hands shook as he typed, asking if Mike was hurt, if he needed help. The reply was worse. Cops are here. Come over. The night was no longer a game. It was a nightmare, and Mike was living it. Nick grabbed his keys, his mind racing. He'd lived with Mike for over a year. Shared beers, laughs, fights, but never this. The upstairs neighbors, two teenagers with cocky smirks, had seemed harmless. Just kids asking for weed. But now they'd crossed a line, their greed turning to violence. Nick's stomach churned as he pictured Mike, pinned to the floor, a gun to his head, betrayed by the people he saw every day. He drove through the dark, the city a blur. His new roommates, Jade and Willard, in the back seat. They'd been gaming, carefree, just moments ago. but now their faces were grim. The triplex loomed ahead, its windows glowing with the red and blue of police lights. Mike was inside, alive but shaken, his eyes hollow. The kids had taken his phone, his wallet, his stash, but worse, they'd taken his sense of safety. Nick felt it too, the betrayal of trust, the fear of what could have been. The story Mike told was a gut punch, each detail sharper than the last. It started with a knock, "Go take you," a simple request, but ended with a gun, a ransacked apartment, and a night that would haunt him forever. Nick listened, his anger rising, his fear for his friend deeper than he'd expected. The kids hadn't just robbed Mike, they'd shattered the illusion that home was safe, that neighbors were just faces you passed on the stairs. Nick had always been cautious, avoiding trouble where he could. He dealt with sketchy people but had common sense to stay away. His friend Mike, though, wasn't as careful. From 20 to 20, Nick and Mike were roommates for a little over a year. Another friend, Jake, moved in with them after overstaying at Nick's place. Living with Mike grew tense, so when Jake offered to move into his mom's old trailer with him and his friend Willard, Nick immediately said yes. Living with Mike was starting to stress him out. In June 20, Nick and Jake moved out. Mike was understanding, with no ill will, which Nick was grateful for, considering him a brother. A month later, things were fine until Nick was up late playing Smite with Jake, Willard, and another friend. He got a message from Mike on Xbox. "Guess who just broke into the house and held me at gunpoint?" Nick's heart raced. He asked who did it, and Mike's response sent chills. "Upstairs, neighbors stole my phone, wallet, and weed." Nick panicked, unsure if Mike was hurt. He asked Jake and Willard if they wanted to go check on Mike, and they agreed. Nick asked Mike if he wanted them to come over or call the cops. Mike replied, "Have like 6 cop cars outside. Just got back from giving my statement. I could use some company." Nick promised to be there fast. Mike said the cops might want to talk to Nick since he'd lived there. Though Nick had only interacted with the neighbors once, within 10 minutes, they arrived at the triplex, where several cop cars were still outside. Mike sat on the couch, shaken. The cops took his paraphernalia and couldn't find his phone, but he was lucky to be alive. Nick, Jake, and Willard asked Mike what happened. Mike's story was chilling. Earlier that afternoon, the upstairs neighbors, us and years old, knocked and asked, "You got any weed to sell?" Mike said no, but would pick some up later. They were annoyed, but said they'd check back. Hours later, they knocked again, asking, "Did you pick some up yet?" Mike, agitated, said no. By night, Mike thought they'd given up. He heard another knock but didn't want to answer, thinking it was someone he knew. It was a mistake. The 2 kids, looking angry, barged in, got Mike on the ground, and held him at gunpoint. They demanded weed and money. Mike swore he had none. One kid held the gun to his head while the other rummaged through the apartment. When Mike pleaded, the kid pressed the barrel harder and told him to stop talking. They took his phone, wallet, and whatever weed he had left, threatening to shoot if he moved. Mike waited, then climbed out the back window to call 911 from a neighbor's. The kids, unbelievably, went back upstairs to their apartment. The cops arrested them, returning Mike's wallet, but not his phone. Nick didn't have to talk to the cops. Mike recovered mentally and moved to a new house with friends. Nick was relieved, haunted by what could have happened. The aftermath left Nick rattled. The triplex, once a home, was now a place of betrayal. He'd met those kids once, passing them on the stairs, their smirks hiding something darker. Mike's story played in his mind: the knock, the gun, the kids' cold eyes. Nick wondered what drove them, what turned neighbors into predators. He dug into the triplex's history, finding rumors of trouble, tenants fighting, deals gone wrong. The landlord likely knew more than he let on, but Nick never asked. Mike stayed with friends for a while, avoiding the triplex that Nick visited, bringing Jake and Willard, their laughter forced as they tried to lift Mike's spirits. But the apartment felt different, its air heavy, the walls holding the echo of that night. Mike replaced his phone, moved on, but Nick saw the change in him, a wariness, a glance over his shoulder. The kids faced charges, but Nick never learned their fate. He hoped they paid, not just for Mike, but for shattering the trust of a home. Nick's new trailer was a fresh start, but he couldn't shake the what-ifs. What if he'd stayed? Would he have been there, facing that gun? He checked his locks obsessively, his trust in neighbors gone. Jake and Willard felt it too, their late-night gaming sessions quieter, their eyes darting to the windows. The triplex had left a mark, a reminder that danger could live just upstairs. One night, Nick drove by the triplex, its windows dark. A new tenant's car in the lot. He wondered if they felt it, the unease, the weight of what happened. Mike never spoke of it again, but Nick knew it lingered. He'd call Mike, checking in, their bond stronger for it. The kids had taken more than a phone. They'd stolen a piece of Mike's peace, and Nick's too. Months later, Nick heard the triplex was sold, the landlord gone. But the memory of that night stayed, sharp as the gun's barrel. He'd see Mike laugh, but his eyes held a shadow, a reminder of the kids who turned a home into a trap. Nick carried on, but the betrayal lingered. He avoided new neighbors, kept his circle tight. Mike's survival was a miracle, but the cost was high. The triplex was just a building, but it had taught Nick a truth. Danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it's the ones you see every day. Some homes hide their threats in plain sight. Some neighbors aren't what they seem. Nick learned that in a triplex where a knock became a nightmare, and trust was the price of survival. Story number 10. The train tracks cut through the small town like a scar, their rusted rails glinting under the evening sun. Emily, barely 6, sat on a bench across the road, her laughter fading as the train's rumble died. Then she saw her, a girl, pale and still, standing on the tracks, her dress torn, her eyes too old for her face. Emily blinked, and the girl was gone. But the air felt wrong, heavy with the silence that wasn't natural. The grass around the bench shivered, though no wind blew, and faint marks appeared in the dirt, small footprints leading nowhere. Days later, the girl returned, not on the tracks, but in Emily's schoolyard, her form flickering like a bad signal. She whispered Emily's name, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through the chatter of other kids. No one else heard. At home, the girl appeared again, her presence colder, closer. She didn't just stand there. She moved, leaving smudges on windows, drawings on paper, as if trying to tell Emily something she couldn't understand. The girl wasn't just a ghost. She was a memory, broken and restless, and she wanted Emily to listen. The tracks weren't just a place. They were a tether, binding her to a past that wouldn't let go. To my knowledge, it started when I was 5 or 6 years old. Emily's family lived in a small Midwest town where old houses and quiet streets felt safe. My family and another family that we were closest to were having dinner, and after we had finished, our parents wanted to have some drinks. So they let us go out to this grass area across the road to play. The grass patch by the train tracks was familiar, fenced for safety. It was a small town we knew very well, and we had been taught all about safety already, so it was all okay. This grass area was right next to these train tracks that were mostly fenced in. As a train passed, Emily saw a girl her age on the tracks, and we had been sitting on a bench looking at the crossing because we heard a train coming and wanted to watch it. And right as the train finished going past, a girl around my age appeared on the tracks. She thought it was a local kid, but the girl vanished. I just kind of stared at her, thinking that she was another kid from the area or something. I ended up looking away, and when I looked back, she was just gone. Days later, the girl appeared at school 300 meters from the tracks, then at Emily's home, a 10-minute drive away. A few days later, I saw her again too, but this time it was at school, and it was around maybe 300 miles away from the tracks. At first, it was just seeing her around town, but then I started seeing her at home too, which was a 10-minute drive away from there. They began talking. The girl's name starting with an S or T, her age uncertain. Eventually, we started talking. Her name started with S or a T, I think, and she was also 5 to 6 years old. She herself wasn't sure of her age, so I think we just went off of my age in the end. She revealed her death, hit by a train while playing with her twin sister during the station's opening. Eventually, though, she told me how she actually died. Her family had been waiting to catch a train at the train station, now museum, next to the grass area. Her and her sister, a twin, I think, had been playing since they got there early. I think it was the grand opening of the station or something. But they had been playing along the tracks and were oblivious to the dangers of trains, and she got hit. And unfortunately, she didn't make it. She warned Emily against the tracks. Turns out that's why she hated me being anywhere near those tracks, Emily told her father, who grew distant. Eventually, I told my dad about her death, just somehow got randomly brought up, I think. But all I really remember is my dad getting a bit distant after this. She stopped mentioning the girl. I stopped talking about her with other people because of that as well. In 2nd grade, the girl drew on a whiteboard, startling Emily's teacher, who thought Emily was schizophrenic, prompting a school change. When I was in the 2nd grade, though, I was in the classroom with my teacher drawing on the whiteboard at some stage. I told her that my imaginary friend drew it years later. I found out that my parents only used the bullying as an excuse to move me because my teacher had told them that she thought that I was schizophrenic. The girl faded, but her voice lingered into 8th grade. I stopped seeing her at some point, but I do remember hearing her in the 8th grade while I was doing really well mentally. Emily's research found no records, but a museum worker confirmed child deaths near the tracks, likely covered up. I looked into it at some stage, and I found nothing about a child's death when I first got skeptical of my memory. But then I asked a worker at the museum, and she said that there were quite a few deaths along the tracks, and that's why they apparently stopped doing passenger service. She told me that she had heard of about 3 kids' deaths along the tracks. but that it was probably covered up. Another incident occurred in 3rd or 4th grade when a man on a beach path spoke of drowning in a 1994 storm, verified later by Emily's sister. But there was also a smaller incident where I actually found someone who matched the incident of a spirit that I talked to at that age. I was in the 3rd or 4th grade on an excursion, and we were walking along a footpath right near a beach. But he just started talking, and apparently I think it was June of 1994, he and some buddies had been out fishing even though a storm was coming. They didn't think that it would be that bad, but none of them have survived. Anyway, I got my sister to look it up when I got home. I just told her that I'd heard someone talking about it, and it was actually a thing. Emily's family recalled her seeing others no one else saw, and her mother had similar experiences as a child. Anyway, those are the 2 main incidences that I remember. But I do remember seeing people that no one else did. My mom, older sister, and older brother, they all remember that too. Also, something that I just remembered to add as well is that my mom had a similar thing as a kid too, allegedly, and she remembers my grandmother, her mom, saying something about it too. The girl left traces, smudges on windows, faint drawings on Emily's notebooks, always of tracks or waves. In dreams, she stood by the rails, her twin's hand in hers, their faces blurred, their voices pleading. The man from the beach appeared too, his clothes dripping, leaving wet footprints that vanished by morning. Emily's mother, a second daughter like her, spoke vaguely of a girl's squirrel she saw as a child, always near water or rails, and always warning her away. The family's history hinted at a pattern. Second daughters seeing what others couldn't. The museum worker's story led Emily to old newspaper archives, mentioning a derailment in the 1920s, hushed up with children among the victims. The beach incident aligned with a documented storm. 6 fishermen lost, their boat found shattered. Emily never spoke to her father about it again, fearing his distance. The tracks, now quiet, and the beach, still stormy, felt like anchors for something that wouldn't rest, something tied to her blood, her mother's, her grandmother's,